Feng Youlan was born on December 4th, 1895 in the market town of Tsinghua, Hunan, during the twilight of the Qing dynasty, in a household where classical primers stood next to newly imported science texts, and where the Confucian exam ethos still shaped daily routines, even as the Republic's first tremors were already being felt. His father, a late Qing magistrate who would later serve the young Republic, taught filial piety by example, while quietly encouraging his son to read translations of Western works. His mother drilled him in Tang poetry to perfect his tones. As a child, he could recite the great learning by heart. Yet he was equally fascinated by stories of steam engines and parliamentary debates that filtered into rural Hunan from treaty port newspapers. When he entered the preparatory division of the newly reorganized Peking University in 1910, the campus itself embodied the clash that would define his life. Red lacquered halls still smelling of incense, and at the same time, lecture rooms where Hu Shi and Chun Duxiu urged students to smash the Confucian shop and embrace scientific reason. Feng absorbed both impulses. He copied passages from Kant's Critique in Japanese translation while compiling marginal notes on Mencius, hoping one day to explain each to the other. The question that seized him was how to render the venerable Chinese tradition intellectually rigorous and existentially relevant in a world suddenly ruled by railways, laboratories, and constitutional law. That question accompanied him to New York in 1923, where a Beiyang government fellowship landed him at Columbia University just as John Dewey's pragmatism dominated American philosophy. Feng listened with admiration as Dewey extolled democracy and experimental intelligence. But he also took graduate seminars with the realist William Pepperell Montague, whose insistence on a mind-independent reality resonated more deeply with the Confucian notion of Li, the objective pattern that orders all things. In his notebooks, he compared Dewey's experience with Zhu Xi's investigation of things, concluding that pragmatism addressed social reform brilliantly yet risked dissolving metaphysics into sociology. His 1926 dissertation, A Comparison of Life and Reality in American Pragmatism and Neo-Confucianism, argued that China possessed an equally powerful philosophical resource once its insights were articulated with modern logical tools. Even in English, the prose bore the cadence of classical Chinese, but the thesis announced a lifelong plan to restate Confucian thought in a systematic form capable of meeting Western philosophy on its own conceptual ground without surrendering its spiritual depth. Returning to China in 1927, he accepted a position at Tsinghua University, which soon became the most vibrant crossroads of Eastern and Western ideas on the mainland. Between 1928 and 1937, his seminars were attended by poets from the Crescent Moon Society and by engineers who sought ethical orientation amid political crisis. Out of that ferment came Zhonghua Zhixue Shi Xinbian, A History of Chinese Philosophy, published in 1934 in Chinese and in 1937 in an expanded English version by Princeton. The two-volume work discarded the old dynastic catalogs of anecdotes and instead classified thinkers by problems of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, placing Taoists and legalists alongside Plato and Kant, and thus demonstrating to an international audience that Chinese philosophy was neither preliterate myth nor mere moral sermon, but a fully fledged intellectual tradition. Feng's underlying purpose was to prove that, Just as the West had its Kantian critique, China possessed the doctrine of the mean, and that both were equally capable of rigorous analysis if handled with the appropriate conceptual instruments. When a Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 scattered universities in China's southwest interior, Feng relocated with a National Southwest Associated University to Kunming, teaching under oil lamplight and revising page proofs in bomb shelters. There he completed exile Lishue, New Metaphysics, in 1939. Building on Zhu, she yet conversant with relativity and quantum mechanics, Feng reinterpreted Li not as a transcendent substance, but as an immanent structure of order expressed through qi, the energy-matter continuum. He distinguished a level of objective principle discoverable by science, a level of ethical principle guiding human relationships, and a level of creative principle that empowered self-transcendence, a tripartite ontology that strove to harmonize empirical verification with moral normativity. He read Whitehead, Casseur, and even translated passages of Heidegger, but insisted that Chinese categories could illuminate their debates on being and value just as effectively as Western terminology illuminated his own tradition. After 1945, the Civil War forced Chinese intellectuals to choose between Taipei and the mainland. Feng remained in Beijing, believing that his task lay with the majority population rather than with a government in exile. The new People's Republic at first embraced his stature. He became vice president of Peking University and a delegate to the inaugural Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. Yet Marxist materialism regarded his metaphysics with suspicion, and in 1951 he produced a shortened history of Chinese thought revised under the light of Marxism, labeling Mencius a democratic idealist and Zhu Xi an ideologue of landlord class interests, changes he would later call bitter medicine for survival. During the anti-rightist campaign, he was criticized but spared imprisonment, protected partly by Zhou Enlai's pragmatism and partly by his international fame. The decade of the Cultural Revolution silenced him almost completely. Stripped of books and forced into self-criticism sessions, he survived by reciting the Laozi to Red Guard teenagers who demanded proofs of his revolutionary sincerity. Yet when the ideological storm subsided with Deng Xiaoping's rise, Feng at age 80 returned to lecture halls packed with students hungry for cultural meaning in the post-Mao vacuum. Between 1978 and 1981, he delivered 6 celebrated lectures on Chinese cultural essence, explaining what he called the 4 planes of the Chinese spirit: aesthetic immediacy, ethical relatedness, metaphysical reflection, and creative transcendence. These talks, later mimeographed nationwide, offered a new generation the possibility of reconciling technological modernization with an indigenous intellectual lineage, and they restored Feng's reputation as the elder statesman of modern Chinese philosophy. He died in Beijing on November 26, 1990, leaving behind 16 volumes of collected works that range from commentaries on the Analects to translations of Plato, from comparative logic to memoirs shaped as confessional dialogues with his own earlier writings. Within China, his historiographical method remains the template for university courses. Abroad, new Confucian thinkers like Tang Junyi and Tu Weiming continue to debate his reinterpretation of Li-Qi dualism, and cross-cultural philosophy programs cite him as a pioneer of symmetric comparison. Critics have not been silent. Marxist scholars still accuse him of idealist revisionism despite his temporary concessions. Post-colonial voices argue that his adaptations risked bending classical Chinese thought into Western molds, and sinologists note that the systematic structure he imposed sometimes flattens the performative richness of the original texts. Yet such controversies only attest to the scale of his endeavor. Feng Youlan's unique achievement was to give the Chinese tradition an international philosophical passport without diluting its native idiom. He proved that the resources for modern intellectual agency lay not in abandoning the past, but in re-articulating it with conceptual rigor and imaginative openness. When one reads new metaphysics today, certain formulations may appear dated and the self-censored passages of the 1950s painfully evident. Yet beneath those historical crusts runs a living insight. The Li, the ordering principle of things, is still at work, and the philosopher's duty is to translate that principle into the consciousness of the age. Feng devoted his long life to that translation, and his thousands of pages continue to challenge any epic that mistakes technocratic efficiency for a complete account of human flourishing.